Hello everyone, welcome to the RB Sides, a music review channel dedicated entirely to reviewing remix albums and EPs. Until now. See, a few months ago I reviewed the Aphex Twin compilation 26 Mixes for Cash. To date it is the only review I've done of an album where the focus is on the remixer, rather than the artist being remixed. I do have more reviews of albums like this planned, but the sad fact is that while there are some artists out there who have officially released remixer retrospective albums to their name, many worthy remixers just don't. Maybe it's due to licensing, maybe they just don't rate their remix work highly enough to compile it, or maybe they're more content to just let the good people of YouTube and Spotify compile that work into handy fan-made playlists. In any case, I thought it would be nice to start a new RB Remixer Retrospective Series, or RBRR for short. These videos will be designed to shine a spotlight on artists with an interesting body of remix work to their name, and I'm going to do that in the only way that I am sufficiently trained for, the tier list. And we're going to start with an artist who is particularly close to my heart, that being the enigmatic haunted rave merchant that is Will Bevan, aka Burial. Burial is one of those rare artists that I was lucky enough to follow since his first releases on Hyperdub back in 2006, and I've long been a fan of his body of work, from his earlier experiments in dubstep, future garage and ambient, to his later move into creating epic multi-part suites of rave detritus. Throughout his time as an active producer, however, Burial's remix output has been even more sporadic and scattered than his own stuff, with only 11 official remixes to his name between 2006 and 2024. And in this video I'm going to review all of them, with one exception that I'll go into later. For each remix, I've listened to them side by side with the original songs, and I'm going to rank them according to how enjoyable I find them to listen to, as well as how creatively I think he transmogrifies the original source material into his own sonic universe. We're going to cover them all in alphabetical order of artists, so let's kick things off with Blackdown Crackle Blues from his 2006 EP Lata. Blackdown is Martin Clark, DJ, producer and head of the record label Keysound Recordings. He's been a regular supporter and occasional collaborator with Burial over the years, and this was Burial's very first remix. The original is not a million miles away from the sound that Burial went on to become known for, in that it is more dubstep adjacent than actual fully fledged dubstep. It's based around a pretty threadbare beat that has no snare drums attached. And the main feature of the song is a vocal sample from Blind Lemon Jefferson's Jack of Diamond Blues from 1926. A track that's so old all of the available sources for it are smothered in vinyl crackle, hence the name Crackle Blues. Over this you've got some slightly coy synth notes, and then later on in the track he adds these deeper bass notes that sound like they're coming from a double bass from a horror film orchestra. It's not too bad, this track. It has a little bit of an air of some of Serpent with Feet's earlier work. Overall though, I'd say it's pretty basic and it doesn't really develop enough compared to other tracks in this kind of genre. Rather than trying to out-dark Blackdown, Burial actually goes the other way and makes it much lighter. Stylistically, you can tell this was recorded around the time of his self-titled debut album, as it's got a similar emphasis on percussion and light bursts of atmosphere. This remix has something closer to a traditional dubstep beat, although the snare sound is very much one of Burial's trademark woodblock sounds. The vocal samples in this one are much more smothered, much more layered, and they feel a lot prettier than they are in the original. As does the ambience that he lays over the track, which I think is possibly taken from the guitar parts of the Blind Lemon Jefferson track. It very much gives it this ethereal pastoral quality akin to Four Tet's earlier folktronica stuff, or maybe Susumu Yokota. What I like about this remix is, for the first half of Burial's career, his sound very much had a nighttime city vibe to it. This one, on the other hand, sounds a lot more daytime and rural. It's a track that brings to mind cherry blossoms, waterfalls, and a yoga retreat with at least a 4.7 rating on TripAdvisor. It's perhaps a little slight, it doesn't have any wow moments, but it's pleasant, chilled, spacious, and a damn good attempt at a first remix. And for that reason, I would say this one slots pretty comfortably in the B tier. Bloc Party, Where Is Home? Researching this one was a journey, let me tell you. This song originally featured on Bloc Party's 2007 album A Weekend in the City, in which they went in a much more overtly political direction. And this song is about Bloc Party lead singer Kelly Okereke's cousin, Christopher Alanimi, who was knifed to death in Kent in 2006 as part of a racist attack. And this song is very explicitly about this from start to finish. In every headline, we are reminded that this is not home for us. It's pretty heavy stuff, and the production, consequently, is quite in your face to match it. I like the start of the track, which is mostly a cappella, but from the point where the drums come in onwards, the production feels like it starts trying to do a little too many things at once. There's a big mournful synth that comes in before the return of the chorus. But it feels kind of at odds with some of the more angry elements, like the guitar. There's also some stuttering percussive elements in there that sound a bit like machine guns. The urgency of the song definitely gives it an edge, and it is very much a message that needs to be heard, but it feels like Kelly is trying to cram every negative emotion he had about the incident into one track, and unfortunately it ends up feeling a little sludgy and overloaded as a result. Given how personal this one is, it's a strange choice to give this one over to an artist for remix. Although there is a chance that it wasn't actually Bloc Party themselves that did this, it might have been a record company thing. At any rate, Burial's remix appears on the 2007 single Flux, which I'll probably have to do a review about at some point, given that the Japanese version is absolutely chock full of remixes from the album. It's a very pretty proposition with this simple piano melody. Although I say piano in typical Burial style, it is absolutely buried in fog and haze. And that bass line has the slightly toned down speed garage feel that just gives the track this warmth. Overall, this is very much in the spirit of the sound that Burial developed on Untrue. It's a beautiful production, but crucially, Burial doesn't use that much of Kelly's vocals throughout. He mainly just loops the Where Is Home, Where Is It chorus from the original and has some slightly garbled parts of another bit of vocal in there. Beyond that, there's a part around 3/4 of the way through where he adds the following vocal refrain from the bridge. It's a lovely little moment that just takes this remix over the top for me, but until I listened to the original recently, I had no idea what it was about, and the remix doesn't really give you much of an impression of that, at least on the vocal side. Phrases like "Where is home" just kind of fit into Burial's aesthetic of music to wander home in the middle of the night to. And in this context, the lyrics about pretending that nothing's wrong fit in very much with a lot of the lyrics that Burial uses about failed relationships and lost love. So you could argue that this remix kind of sanitizes the message of the original by leaving a lot of the more specific lyrics on the cutting room floor and just focusing on the more general ones. None of this is me saying that Burial should have put the entire song into his production, because it's not really what he does. Most of the vocals in Burial tracks revolve around fragmented feelings rather than specific details. There's only one track that I can think of in which he actually broke cover on that regard, and that's Come Down to Us.
Years later, I find the courage to admit that I am transgendered, and that this does not mean that I am unlovable.
It's the only time that Bevan has ever given explicit social commentary in his music, and in this case it was added to the end as a postscript. With all that said, if you read Wire Magazine's interview with Burial, you do get the sense of Bevan as a pretty emotionally erudite man who understands the human condition. He talks a little bit about the soul icon Sam Cooke and how his music often had a pretty jaunty demeanour to it, even though it was about some fairly dark stuff. He also talks about feeling protective of people and the ways in which adult issues are kind of forced upon young people. And the more of Bevan's words that I read, the more I felt like actually this Block Party remix is pretty appropriate. Even if it only gives snippets of the lyrics, it conveys that sense of loneliness, of sadness, of loss. I would put this one in the A tier. It's not quite at the level of going into S, as I think the track is a little short and leaves you wanting, but it is a beautiful piece overall. I really like this remix.
When the day is done,
Charles Webster, Ingrid Chavez, The Spell. This is the most recent remix that Burial has done to date. The original is taken from Webster's album Decision Time in 2020. I have his previous album, Born on the 4th of July. I think it's a pretty decent collection of deep house and neo-soul. Some of it veers a little too heavily into dad house for me, but there are some pretty beautiful moments throughout, particularly in my favourite track, Your Life. Not heard the full album that The Spell is from, but certainly the album version of this track seems somewhat muddled. It's built around this tribal drumming that constantly seems like it's waiting for the kick drum to turn up throughout. It's a weird beat that feels simultaneously too low energy and too busy.
I have no maps, no plans, no sleight of hand, just blind faith.
Over the top of this, you've got Chavez doing some spoken word. I do quite like the use of spoken word in dance music every now and then, but here it just gives it the quality of a track that's being played in some sort of arts cafe. All these lyrics about standing at the end of a road and love being everything just make me think, do I have to start clicking now? Also, this sort of breathy lyricism is nothing new in Charles Webster's music. There's all these little melodic details that Webster adds as the track goes along as well, like a few high strings, some backward drones and whooshes, a surge of what sounds like a slightly knackered brass section.
When I was young, a broken heart was just a song to be sung. I remember all the long, lonely nights.
It just feels messy and formless, and to be honest with you, even Webster's own remix of it improves things tenfold. It's got a really nice mangled sunrise quality to it, but more importantly it's got a much more discernible beat. And on the same EP as this remix, you also have Burial's version. Of all Burial's remixes, I feel this is the one that has the most in common with the artist being remixed, if not necessarily the specific track. It basically sounds like classic Webster, but more layered and with more of those washed out touches that Burial adds. You've got this gorgeous distant piano loop that reminds me of Fortet or Caribou. In the breakdown in the middle, you've got these Boards of Canada-esque synth drones that provide these wonderful waves of energy.
A broken heart was just a song to be sung.
And there's this cute vocal sample that sounds like a ghost trying to sing along with Big Ben. Woo, 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 woo. The beat is much simpler than the original, although there's an occasional doubling of it that he does as a blemish. Although as far as blemishes go, it's nowhere near as irritating to me as the crackling. I generally like the use of crackling in Burial songs, but here it really feels like it's gone out of control. It just feels like it's been smothered across indiscriminately to the point where I'm wondering, was this remix actually done in 1926 as well? The track drifts along at a low level until the 5-minute mark when it changes into one of Burial's classic codas. The vocals are still here, but they're reduced to just a few key phrases that are repeated throughout. It goes into an auto-tuned, time-stretched version of the vocal and a much more minor key atmosphere. You've got this sort of adult contemporary piano, and the vocals are changed into something much more Burial-like. They actually remind me a little bit of Terza. I do quite like this track, but I'm not convinced it adds that much that you don't normally get in a Charles Webster song. It just kind of sits at that low level for 5 minutes and then goes into a completely different section at the end. And I feel like those big shifts in Burial songs feel a lot better when there's been much more of a journey to get there effectively, which it doesn't feel like there is in this one. Overall though, it's a gorgeous track and there's a lot to like about this one. I would put this at the higher end of the B tier. Comics Be True, the first of 2 remixes that Burial did for Goldie's Metalheadz label. This is another instance where I bought the Burial remix at the time it was released and didn't even bother checking out the original. And more for me, because listening to the original in preparation for this review, it's pretty darn good. Comics are, as you might expect, a drum and bass group, but their style is very much influenced by Detroit techno, such as Derek May, and you can hear that in the gorgeous ambience that carries throughout this track. A lot of it is built around this loop, which I initially thought was a flute, but upon further inspection, it actually seems like it's a bit of vocal from Sade's I Never Thought I'd See the Day.
The truth I was hiding.
Yeah, there's some impressive sound transformation going on here, and I love the little bit of harp that is sprinkled underneath as well. There's another vocal sample that's a bit more obviously the human voice, and that comes from Nina Simone's You Can Have Him.
All I ever wanted to do was
It's also the place where Comics got the harp sample from, so it's quite the toolkit. The vibe I get from this is very much forest clearing, sun peeking through the trees, a few rabbits jumping around. But jumping around in a just getting on with their day kind of thing rather than in a happy ecstasy. There are a couple of moments in this I'm less keen on, but overall I think this is a really nice dreamy piece of liquid drum and bass. Burial's remix was released as the lead single from the remix album Recall to Mind, and of all Burial's remixes, I would say this is the one that has the least in common with the original. For one, we're back into nighttime cityscape territory, although this one sounds like it's been recorded in a downpour. The vocals in this don't sound like Sade or Nina Simone. In fact, they don't even sound like they're saying the same words. The main vocal refrain sounds like it's just saying pump it up. I don't think Nina Simone was a member of Technotronic, but I wasn't really paying attention at that age. The beat is very submerged on this one. The snare is practically a hi-hat. Occasionally it goes into this 4/4 techno beat, but it drops out fairly quickly each time. I think this remix is decent, but I do feel like it peaks a little too early. There's this great loose melody in the first breakdown that sounds like it's being played on a train horn. It's a lush little detail, but after that, the track doesn't really offer anything quite as good. It just sort of pootles along at that low level for the rest of the track, and although there's a nice little thunderclap around the 4-minute mark, it just feels like it blows its best idea way too early. There's a nice little loop at the end that's much lighter, and it sounds the most like the comics' original song. So perhaps thrown in there as a bit of a token nod to the original. But yeah, although I enjoy this remix, it feels like it peaks too early and there just aren't enough sharp details for the rest of the track. So I would put this in the B tier, and think I would put this in between Webster and Blackdown. Inner City Life by Goldie. This is the second of Burial's Metalheadz remixes and the first of 2 tracks that remix 90s rave classics. I want to preface my review of the remix here by saying that I've never had any particularly strong feelings about the original. I know a lot of people consider it to be a classic, none more so than Goldie himself, but personally I can take it or leave it. Having said that, I do enjoy the flotation tank chords that are at the centre of this track, and the iconic vocals from Diane Charlemagne work really well over them. The lyrics are about yearning for love as an antidote to hectic urban life, and thus it feels appropriate that Charlemagne sounds like she's calling for help throughout. Listening back to the original version though, I've realised what it is I don't like about it, and that's the drums. Once I started focusing on these ones, I found them kind of irritating. I don't know, maybe it's because of how much faster drum and bass got subsequently, but these kind of feel a little cumbersome and laboured. I think the original's fine. I like the concept of it more than the execution though. The melodic and harmonic stuff I like, the rhythmic stuff less so. Burial's remix of Inner City Life is, as far as I can tell, one of his most divisive remixes. Even Goldie, who loves the remix, talked to Giles Peterson about how he played it to friends of his who just didn't vibe with it at all. I actually hadn't given this remix a go before I started researching this review, and now that I've heard it, I kind of think Goldie's friends are right. You have this pretty up-tempo breakbeat that sounds like a faster version of the one he used on Rival Dealer. This just slams in abruptly after some police car noises, along with a melody that sounds like it's been made from pitched down clown horns. After a short amount of time, another melody comes in, and this one sounds like it's a sped up version of a John Carpenter soundtrack. And apart from some subtle elements of ambience, he doesn't really add much to this composition. There's no bass line or anything, and it just stays at this weirdly overcranked level for most of the runtime. There's a few breakdowns, but this is from the period of Burial's production where the breakdowns were painfully stop-start. Worst of all with this remix though is the fact that Charlemagne's vocals just seem like they've been carelessly strewn all over the place. Doesn't even seem like he's made any effort to make sure they're in tune. For the last third of the track, Burial takes a different tack, starting with some beautiful crepuscular chords that sound like they could have come from 808's States Pacific. It then goes into what sounds like a medley of half-remembered rave tracks for the final minute, which is not dissimilar to what he did in Temple Sleeper. Although whereas that track had around 6.5 minutes to work with that format, here Burial tries to cram a similar amount of melodies into 80 seconds. And although there's some really cool stuff in this section, it just makes me think, why couldn't he have used these elements more throughout the rest of the track? If you look at the most replayed feature on the YouTube video of this track, you can see that most people's focus is very much towards the last 2 minutes of the song. It just feels willfully frustrating that the least appealing aspects of this remix are the ones that Burial chooses to nurse the most. So yeah, I just find this remix pretty aggravating overall, and that's why I'm going to put this one in the D tier.
I know dark clouds gather around me. I know my way.
Jamie Woon, Wayfaring Stranger. This track is from the EP of the same name that Woon released as his debut. Wayfaring Stranger is a 19th century folk song that's been done by loads of artists over the years.
I am a poor wayfaring stranger,
Traveling through
this world below.
Usually an acoustic string instrument and the same vocal phrasing more or less. Woon goes in a quite different direction with his cover version, turning it into a cappella song, looping his own voice in 6/8 time to create this supporting choir.
I am a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world alone.
There's a slight beat in the mix, but it's clearly been created just from a combination of stomping and clicking. It's a decent take on the song, and it seems to have been quite influential given that Ed Sheeran's a cappella version of the song uses pretty much the same composition, which does make it all the more frustrating that there are articles out there that cite this particular rendition to Sheeran rather than Woon. As good a rendition as Woon's version is though, I will say that it doesn't really give you a great sense of his personality, and ultimately it ends up just feeling more like an audition piece, as if Woon's saying, "Hey music industry, I've got a great voice, can you give me something to use it on?" And functionally, it certainly seems like Burial's remix ended up being an audition piece as well, as it did lead to Woon hiring Bevan to produce his solo album Mirror Writing afterwards.
I don't need those car crash colors.
In the end, he only ended up producing 3 of the album's tracks, as according to Woon there was a little bit of a disjuncture, given that Woon was still very much trying to find his artistic voice and Burial had a very distinctive one. This remix is another up-tempo one. It's got these glorious oceanic bells that form the main melodic qualities. The backing choir from the original seems to have been pitched down significantly and has been turned into this almost demonic wind. This is a rare Burial remix that actually uses the full lyrics of a song as well, which, given that the original was in a slightly different time signature and a completely different tempo to this, makes it a little bit of a bumpy ride. It's possibly an aspect of the pacing as well, like the vocals come in very near the beginning and then the beat just suddenly comes in underneath it.
There's no sickness, toil or danger in that bright land to which
And everything just feels a little too busy too quickly. I think in the later point of the track it settles, and the last quarter of the track, which is instrumental, is really good. It's kind of lush. It's almost like a future garage rendition of Show Me the Way to Go Home, something you might sing in the night bus while you're drunk. It just has a few compositional issues that dull its impact for me, but I still think it belongs in the B tier, and I put it just above Black Down. Can't see Black Down properly now. Let's just... there we go. Better not put anything else in the B tier or I'm going to push myself off the screen. Luke Slater, Love. This is the other 90s track that Burial remixed, and another one that I think has been a little bit divisive. Bevan cited the original as a favourite of his, and I can definitely see why it would appeal. It's an interesting juxtaposition of this rough-edged techno beat with these gorgeous rave chords. The beat is a little busy for my liking. It sounds like a clock with the word grey being repeated through a kazoo. And there's a spoken word sample in it which is quite buried. You can't really hear what it's saying. So it's got that mumblecore Alvin Lucia thing of just reducing speech to a series of sounds. Although rather pleasingly it does seem to be in tune with the melodic elements throughout. It builds pretty well, the chords get more harmonies as the track goes along, and yeah, it's alright. Maybe a little too static for me overall, but I'd definitely be fine with this on in the background. The Burial remix is another one I'd not heard prior to researching this review, and I've seen some people online say that they find this one kind of boring and uninspiring, and I very much disagree with that assessment, but this is definitely his most subtle remix. It starts with a vocal loop that sounds similar to the original one but pitched down, and it also sounds like it's saying fear rather than grey. A basic 4 to the floor beat comes in with the occasional Joey Beltram-esque stutter. It's a deeper, more restrained take on the track with better pacing for my money, but what really makes this one something special for me are the chords that Burial puts over it. There's actually 2 different chord sequences that Burial uses in his remix. One of them is a set of sweeping pads that sounds very similar to the ones that Slater used in the original. Although here, because the beat is more subdued, they're given a bit more breath. Elsewhere in the track though, Burial adds this more sombre 2-chord sequence that sounds like a funereal church organ. And it's that juxtaposition of the ecstasy and the melancholy that each time I listen to this remix it just gets that little bit more sublime for me. The mumbled vocals from the original come in eventually and they're still kind of buried and impenetrable, sounding kind of like a wasp struggling to make a decision. But yeah, lovely sunset quality to this one, and it also features probably one of my favourite vocal samples I've ever heard in a Burial track. It's such a lovely detail to throw in at the end there, it just rounds the whole thing off perfectly. So yeah, I can see why people might not be that into one, but I like this one a lot. It's not quite up there in S tier for me, just due to the fact that the track doesn't do that much overall, but definitely belongs in the A tier. I think I'm going to put this just below the Block Party one.
For the ones that feels it the most.
Paradise Circus by Massive Attack. This is one of two remixes that Burial did for Massive Attack, both of which appeared on an EP released in 2011. Originally, it was suggested by Massive Attack member Daddy G that this was going to be a full-length Mad Professor style reworking of their Heligoland album, which even at the time sounded like an unrealistic proposition, and in an interview subsequently, G did concede that he was probably drunk when he said that. The other remix here is of a unreleased track called Four Walls. And owing to the fact that the original doesn't seem to exist anywhere public, I'm not actually going to cover that remix, purely on the grounds that I don't have an original to compare it to, so it wouldn't really be fair to try and slot that into this tier list. Although, as a track in and of itself, I will say that I prefer the Paradise Circus remix, so for me we're at least going with the better one on this tier list. The original is pretty famous as it was used as the theme song to Luther. For my money, it's one of the best songs on Heligoland, although it's not an album that I was particularly fond of, even though I did think it was an improvement on their previous album, 100th Window. The first half doesn't do a huge amount for me, as I find the hand-clappy quality of the drums a little bit overwrought when paired up with those piano marimba chords that form the core of the track.
But we like it when we're spinning.
Hope Sandoval's vocals are great on this. They've got a little bit of that Sneaker Pimp 6 Underground quality, but they don't feel as forced. It's the second half of the track that really makes it worthwhile for me though, with the strings that come in at the late 2-minute period. As they go along, the orchestra's got this kind of tortured pyramid song quality to it. I like it. It's a track that very much rewards you for sticking out what I feel is kind of a slightly underwhelming intro. Burial's remix of it is his longest remix of his career, clocking in at 12.5 minutes. But impressively, it doesn't really feel like that, and I think that might partly be down to the fact that the tempo on this one is just so languid. Most of the harmonic elements of the original are replaced by these chords that sound remarkably like Rhubarb by Aphex Twin to me. These glide over the subtle beat that Burial has created that sounds a bit like a ticking clock. One aspect that I really like about the beat in this remix is there are moments when Burial cuts to a later part of the percussive meter so that it's actually the melody that's calling the shots in this remix rather than the rhythm. Initially I found this kind of distracting, but after a while I really started to enjoy this device. Sandoval's vocals work really well on this new composition, and there's loads of lovely little bits of sound design throughout, like these whistling winds and glass screeches, what sounds like bats shrieking across a field. Then around 7.5 minutes in, Burial switches things up a bit by dropping things down to just some chords and background reverberating wails. A brief techno beat then comes in, but after that it then goes into another one of those key changes, like the one he used at the end of the Charles Webster remix. Here though it feels like a much more natural shift in tone, and it rounds off the track just excellently well. I think this remix is widely considered to be one of Burial's masterpieces, and I will admit it took a little while to grow on me, but very much a fan of this one now, and I would happily put this into the S tier. Monic Deep Summer. This appeared on a single of the same name back in 2017. Monic is a pseudonym of Simon Shreve, who runs the Osiris music label that released this track. Sonically, the original has a fair bit in common with Burial, although I would say it's not as nuanced. Also makes me think a little bit of artists associated with the cloud rap subgenre or adjacent to it. Artists like Clams Casino, Balam Camp, Forest Swords. There are vocals in there that are smothered in reverb in a similar style to those artists. This big industrial sized trip hop beat and some atmospheric waves and chords over the top. I did quite like this track when I first heard it, but subsequent listens have found it shrinking on me somewhat. It's sort of what I call auto dark in music. It's like when a track just tries to be dark without really giving that much thought to the ways that it does it. Something I've noticed with the remixes so far in this list is that Burial does seem to make a concerted effort to make his remixes completely distinct from the original versions. And here he absolutely surpasses himself. This one's built around a slow techno beat and samples of what sounds like a thumb piano that almost ends up sounding like a tiny steel drum band that Bevan pulled out of his pocket. This sample sounds a lot like one used in the collaboration that Burial did with Four Tet and Tom York called Ego. Which is fine. Burial reuses samples all the time, but generally he's very good at making them have a different effect and changing the way that they're framed each time. There's also a weird little reggae vocal sample that gets thrown in here. Come on, come on, come on, come on, oh. I sort of keep expecting this track to go into a more indie version of Under the Sea by Sebastian the Singing Crab. This is such a densely layered and wonderfully vibrant remix of this though. It keeps on bringing in great new elements as it goes along. Wind tunnel chords, a mournful sounding flute. Then around the 6.5 minute mark it goes into these beautiful sunrise chords. Then just when you think it can't get any better, you hear this young voice go, and we go into this final section that has this pluck guitar that sounds like the melody from Coldplay's Clocks and just jamming the hell out of it. Resulting in something much, much more beautiful than Coldplay could ever conceive. Big warm bass chords in the background, and yeah, it's got this wonderful Balearic feel to it. Absolutely amazing remix, this one, and this goes right at the top of the S tier. Not just one of Burial's best remixes, but probably one of Burial's best tracks in his entire career. Slight warning about this final section. I made a bit of an error with the recording in which I ended up leaving the tier list on screen for the whole time, mainly because I'm a dunce. However, I've slotted in a colour graded picture of Tom York to cover up the offending error, so hopefully it shouldn't be too distracting. Finally, Thom Yorke and It Rained All Night, originally from his 2007 solo debut, The Eraser. This was an album I bought at the time and was fairly underwhelmed by, as I gather quite a few people were. Yorke did say in an interview that the main reason the album came about was he just wanted to learn what it was like to produce an album himself, so it's pretty unassuming. And for what it's worth, I do think his solo stuff has developed significantly over the years, with Anima being a particularly good album. And It Rained All Night starts with a shaking pulse, and then you get this beat that's basically kick, kick, There's these sticks in the background that I think are supposed to be like hi-hats, but they end up being kind of annoying. And the bass line in here is played, but it feels a bit off to me, like it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the track. Favourite part of the track for me are these shimmering synths that have something of a Two Lone Swordsman quality to them. I also like the imagery that Yorke paints with his lyrics about what's happening with the rain.
The drops are the size of your hands or face. The worms come out to see what's up.
Doesn't matter what I do, I just don't seem to be able to get away from those damn worms. Overall though, like much of the Eraser album, I find this song a bit too rigid, too starchy. This track feels less like getting caught in the rain and more like when you shelter under a tree and the leaves just filter all the rain into much heavier drops that end up being much more annoying. Burial's take on the track appears on the Eraser Remix album, which I am interested in doing a review of at some point on this channel. And his remix does fix some of the issues with the original track, but also brings some others along. It has a kind of techno-y beat, much more precise than the original one, and kind of similar to the beat he uses on Homeless on the Untrue album. Harmony here is created by a looped bit of Yorke's vocal, which goes into this kind of disconcerting warble, like a wasp that's very much made a decision. That hum that Yorke used as a surrogate snare drum in the original is kind of replicated in this remix, and the click click clack stick sounds are there but much less frequent. My main problem with this one though is it just kind of sounds half finished. It's very percussion focused and it does end up adding some much needed space to the track as a result, but there's not a great deal in terms of melody or harmony on this one. The synths in it are kind of buried and Yorke's vocals are pitched up and sped up, which isn't an uncommon device in Burial tracks, but here just kind of makes it sound like it's being played at the wrong speed. Just kind of rattles along for 4 minutes and then it stops in a way that feels more like it's cutting its losses than leaving you wanting more. Sort of feels like an unsatisfying halfway point between the percussive style of the Burial self-titled album and the more vocal, lush style of Untrue. So yeah, this one for me belongs in the C tier. It's not dreadful, but definitely feels like it's lacking compared to many other Burial tracks. And that is that, gang. That has been my Burial remixes tier list. Do you agree with these placings, disagree with them, ambivalent to them? Do let me know in the comments below. And if there are any remixers out there who you would like to see me do a similar retrospective video about, then please do let me know in the comments. And of course, please do subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified about future remix review content. Thank you for watching. This video is over.